From being called a connoisseur of the sport to having some pretty controversial opinions, Joe Rogan is a man of his word, even when they don't always make sense. Take his recent take on Masvidal and the legend St. Pierre, for instance. Let's just say that it didn't exactly sit well with people. There are many debates in the world of the UFC. One of the most prominent and timeless ones is that of the greatest MMA fighter ever. It's hotly contested, but a few names are always mentioned whenever the conversation starts, because both fans and professionals believe that these names definitely deserve the title, like Jon Jones, GSP, Anderson Silva, Khabib Nurmagomedov, or Demetrius Johnson, all of whom have left a solid mark on the sport. In a surprising twist of events, it looks like the list has a new addition, or at least that's what Rogan thinks. He believes that Masvidal is not just a good fighter, but it's better than St. Pierre. I'm sure you've never heard that one before. When attempting to explain why he said this, Rogan thinks that the level of competition Masvidal faced was just higher. Here's how he made this deduction. St. Pierre was so good at UFC that he raised the bar. That part checks out, but the next part is a bit iffy if I'm being honest. Rogan thinks the athlete defeated some good fighters, but the guys that Kamaru Usman beat were better, highlighting Colby Covington, Jorge Masvidal, and Tyron Woodley. If you're confused here, let me clarify. He's looking at the victories and opponents faced by the fighters in question to make his judgment. But hey, even Luke Combs was a bit confused, so don't be shy about feeling the same. The country singer was the guest on the Joe Rogan Experience, where the man was talking about all of this, and he felt compelled to question exactly what the host was thinking. He literally wondered if Rogan was actually saying what we all thought he was saying. The comparison is so out of the box, not to mention that it absolutely makes no sense. If you ask me, it seems like Rogan is a bit too confused. While it can be argued that the American is a good fighter, it isn't enough for him to be compared with someone who took the UFC by storm. He responded to Combs, saying that had Masvidal been alive at the time of GSP, he'd be dangerous for just about everybody. The welterweight contender is on a whole other level according to him, and everyone else is just far less superior. Now, I just want to say that the two fighters in question were in the game around the same time. But that didn't stop Rogan from going off. He reminisced about the one peak moment in Masvidal's career, of course. I'm talking about the famous flying kick that knocked out Ben Askren. Rogan thinks that that was one of the craftiest moves anyone has ever pulled. If you recall, Gamebred went sideways, ran straight at Askren, and kneed him into a different dimension. A brutal, memorable, and quick finish indeed. The commentator continued that he also knocked out Yves Edwards with a head kick back in the day, making him an assassin and a gangster. But let's be honest, that doesn't bring him even close to St. Pierre. I mean, just look at the incredible stats that St. Pierre has. He absolutely demolished his opponents in the welterweight division. And at his peak, he made 9 defenses of his undisputed title. After that, he didn't exactly lose his title. He walked away from the sport temporarily in 2013. So technically, if he'd continued, nothing would have stopped him from continuing his reign as a king. And you'd think the Canadian's reputation ended there. But no, the fighter returned 4 years later in the most badass and bodacious way. He came back just to dethrone the UFC middleweight champion, Michael Bisping. And then, to make his point, he retired from MMA altogether. He came back just to steal the glory for a single day, prove his worth again, and then walk out with another title. St. Pierre boasts a wonderful 26-2 record in his entire career. That's not something a lot of fighters can boast about. And his 2 defeats? They were against Matt Serra and Matt Hughes. Both Matts were defeated in rematches later on in his Hall of Fame career. On the other hand, what has Masvidal done? He made his debut just 1 year after GSP. So to counter Rogan, they definitely did exist in the same era. And no, Masvidal was not the assassin he thought he was. The American has never been a champion in his entire career, and he's lost 16 of his 51 fights. Has he put together one or two impressive runs of victories? Sure, like the one in 2019. But even then, he was no match for Kamaru Usman, who, by the way, knocked him out so bad it made headlines. So after all this, even right now, Masvidal is on a 3-fight losing streak. He's struggling to get his career back on track, or else that resignation letter is staring him directly in the face. So I don't think that this high praise came out of nowhere. It's coming right before Masvidal films a podcast with Rogan to talk about his next fight with Gilbert Burns at UFC 287. He's fighting for his life and career right now, and Burns is no easy competitor. If he does come out victorious, it could possibly set up a highly anticipated grudge match with his rival, Leon Edwards. Edwards holds a title right now and has his eye on Masvidal. That's the only thing going for him right now. Going back to where I started, Gamebred couldn't help but compliment Rogan right back. Rogan is a legendary voice of UFC, which is why it was such a shock when he made this bizarre statement. Despite his years of experience, this isn't the first time his opinion has received backlash. Gamebred was thrilled at the high praise, and in response, he expressed his gratitude. He thinks very highly of Rogan, saying that the guy has been watching sports forever and is essentially an encyclopedia of UFC. So when Masvidal heard that such an experienced man considers him to be one of the better fighters to have lived, it definitely gave him a boost for his upcoming fight. He even called Rogan a connoisseur of this sport. But on the other hand, former UFC middleweight and light heavyweight title challenger Chael Sonnen came out firing shots. He said point blank that Rogan is on drugs because the statement he made wasn't rational in any sense of the word. And hey, I don't blame him for the reaction. He also acknowledged that the commentator is amazing at his job, but when you talk a lot, you're bound to get some things wrong. Sonnen said his current comment should be dismissed because it states that today's competitors are tougher and the competition is harder. But that doesn't have anything to do with St. Pierre and his stellar career. A better theory would be to ponder over which fighter could in fact take down GSP if everyone's better in this era, because he already left his mark on the sport. And on the other hand, Masvidal is out here considering retirement. UFC 287 could be the last we see of him. He hinted that if he loses to Burns, it will tempt him to retire, saying that this could be the last one. If he doesn't come out victorious, he's calling it quits. But winning is going to give him an entirely different attitude. It would mean things are going in the right direction with his career. And it'll prompt him to go for all the titles that he can. Even though he's on the longest losing streak of his career, he thinks he's at his best right now mentally and physically. And maybe Rogan is to blame. That was Joe Rogan's controversial take on Jorge Masvidal being a better fighter than GSP.